Well, welcome everybody. I am so excited that you're joining this webinar because I was really excited about this webinar. It's definitely a very timely subject, and I think everybody really needs to get on this ASAP. So with me today, I have Jocelyn Thompson of the Principal and CEO of WorkVision Consulting. Jocelyn has a boutique diversity, equity, and inclusion consulting firm here in the Bay Area. She really values driven companies striving to create a new way of work. And her services will include things like DE&I plans, providing training and implementation, and assessing compensation equity. So I want to give a warm welcome as she talks about diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is a very important topic for me. All right, take it away.
Thank you so much, Darcy. So today we're going to talk about how to make your business next level through diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how to make systemic change within your organization. So starting out, thank you again, Darcy, for that introduction. Again, my name is Jocelyn. This is a little information about WorkVision Consulting. My pronouns are she, her. I am coming from the Bay Area. I live in Concord, California, and I'm on stolen Ohlone land. And a little bit more about my work experience. So I started WorkVision Consulting pretty recently, just last year. But before that, I started my career in hospitality management, and I worked in retail management after that. And I did that for my first 7 years of my career. And then I transitioned over into the HR space. So with the HR space, I was doing that for a while, and then officially started working in diversity, equity, and inclusion in 2018 when I took the diversity and inclusion certificate from Cornell University. And I've taken lots of different certifications and webinars and all those great things where I've really dived into this work. And I'll talk a little bit about how this work, it of course overlaps with human resources work, but it also encompasses so much more. So we'll talk about that. Also, hopefully you should see captions on the webinar. So those are provided for people who are hard of hearing. I'm also going to do picture descriptions, really brief ones for any slide that has a photograph or an image on it. A lot of those slides will just have words, so if you don't hear a picture description, that means there isn't a picture. But on this intro slide, this is a picture of me, a headshot standing in front of a blue door. I'm wearing a blue dress, pink lipstick, and I have light brown hair.
I don't see that, Jocelyn.
All right. You do see the captions, though.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Okay. So I love this quote from John Powell. John Powell is from the Belonging Institute in Berkeley, California. And it's, we all need each other and we all have each other. I really believe that diversity, equity, and inclusion work is really collective work. And so we'll talk about how, we all need to do this work together. It's not one person that really needs to be doing this work. And when you're talking about doing this within your company, it's really important to get everyone on board, which can be difficult, but we'll talk about some of the things that you can address with employees to get them there. Okay, so a few ground rules for today and a little bit of housekeeping. As I mentioned, there are captions, so you should see those. You should be able to write in the chat. You can chat directly with us as panelists, and Darcy's going to be monitoring that today. Or if you want to introduce yourself, you can chat with panelists and attendees. You just want to change that. When you're doing that, first rule is be respectful. So no spam, no promoting things. You can, of course, put your LinkedIn in there if you want to connect with people, but not promoting other things that you're selling, and also no hateful language in there. The second part is if you do want to ask any questions today, which Darcy is also going to be monitoring, you'll want to put those in the Q&A. So instead of in the chat. And the reason for that is it will capture all those Q&A for afterwards. So if there's any that we don't get to, we'll make sure to answer those in the follow-up email that I'm going to send out. With that follow-up email, it's going to include the recording of the webinar along with the slides. So you'll have access to all this information afterwards if you want to share it with anyone. if you want to revisit the recording, of course. And with that, I'm also going to share a lot of links within that email. So you'll have, resources that I use, sources that I used, if you want to check those out further. A few more ground rules, just be open today. If there's anything you hear that you're unsure about, you can always follow up with me with questions and we can discuss it further, but just really be open to learning new things and, kind of expanding what your thought process behind DE&I is. And then acknowledge your privilege. I'll talk about that a little later on, what privilege is, but that's a really important piece of diving into this work, is acknowledging where you have privilege and maybe where you don't. And then lastly, just always keep learning. No one knows everything, but together we know a lot. So I love this idea. It goes along with that collective work of, we all need to be working on this. And when we work on this together, we can really accomplish some great things. So today, what we're going to cover, I'm going to talk about myths of diversity, equity, and inclusion. I have 6 different myths that I hear all the time, and I'll address, what the reality is. We're going to talk about groups that DE&I work can benefit. And then we'll go into the business case for investing in DE&I. So I have some case studies that show implicit bias, and then I'm also just going to provide a whole bunch of data that supports doing DE&I work. So we'll go into all of that, and like I mentioned, you'll have that to access after the presentation as well, if you need to use it to convince your leadership to do more of this work. And then we will talk about where to start. So I'll give 3 specific examples of where your business can dive into this, and then also how you can partner with a consultant like me. So myth number 1, diversity, equity, and inclusion work is only about gender and race. Here we have a photo of 2 Black women who are sitting on a couch in professional dress. One of the things I love about this photo is this woman's shirt has a cat print on it. So the fact that DE&I work is only about gender and race is such a huge myth. What I will say about this is that it's a very important piece of DE&I. So I will definitely be talking about it today. But it's not the only piece, and there's so much more out there that we talk about. One of the reasons that I think it gets talked about so much is that visually when we meet people, gender and race are the first things we automatically assess about them. That's just part of human nature. And also when we see people's names, which I'll talk about later, we are trying to form images in our mind, and gender and race are 2 of those pieces. And so that's going to come up a lot. The other piece of it is gender and race data is the most collected. So we have the most of it. And so it's the easiest thing to compare to because there's a lot of it out there. However, what I have here on this slide is all the different protected classes in the state of California. Now, I know not everyone here is in California, but the thing to note about protected classes is if someone's in a protected class, they're likely part of a marginalized group. And so with all these different classes, there's a way that you can think about DE&I for all of these groups. So what we have is race, which includes traits historically associated with race, like hair texture and protective hairstyles, ethnicity, color, national origin, ancestry, citizenship status, sex or gender, which includes pregnancy, childbirth, or related medical condition, and sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, and transgender status. Then we have religion, which includes religious dress and grooming practices, age 40 and up, medical condition or disability, genetic information, and AIDS, HIV status, veteran or military status, political activities or affiliations, marital or domestic partnership status, and a status as a victim or survivor of domestic violence, assault, or stalking. So lots of different things on this list. And also this list is always changing. So always being updated, always different things to think about.
And Jocelyn, someone's asking, what are your thoughts on including justice and or belonging? Is there a reason you haven't?
Yeah, that's a good question. For me, I'll talk about the different definitions of diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think social justice work is super important, and I do include it when I talk about this work, absolutely. I just haven't included it in the initial language that I'm using because I feel like the work I'm doing, DE&I, sort of covers everything in a way. So when we get into the definitions, you'll see that things like belonging are in there. Um, so hopefully that answers that question. Yeah, I think it's very important, and language is very important. I do also think that sometimes we can overthink the language we're using and make it a little more complicated. So yeah, that's kind of my thought on that. But great question, thank you. So the next myth is that diversity, equity, and inclusion work is about filling hiring quotas. And often I think that DE&I work is really focused on recruiting and also really focused on hiring. And it's so much more than that. Here we have a photo of two people shaking hands over a table. You can just see their hands, and one of them is holding a resume. So with this work, often you will just see people focused on hiring for racial and gender diversity and trying to meet quotas, which is not what we want to do. We definitely want to look at data when we do this work and look at racial and gender data as well as other data. And we want to look at it across the whole company and different levels of the company. So, from your staff all the way up to your C-suite. But we want to make sure that this is done holistically and also that we're looking at inclusion. So when we're just hiring to fill quotas, we often see tokenism happen. So we hire a particular person to meet a demographic that we don't have, and then that person is the one and only and doesn't feel a sense of inclusion or belonging at work. So that's a really important piece that we don't want to leave out. And sorry, that picture description is 3 people who are working together, ethnically diverse group working on an iPad, and the woman in the photo is wearing a hijab. So myth 3, diversity, equity, inclusion work is complete when we've done anti-bias training. So here we have 3 women sitting at a table in suits, and they're watching a training on a video. Possibly an anti-bias training. So when we talk about bias training, it is a really important piece of DE&I work, but it's often done standalone and doesn't actually have the effect that we want it to. So Harvard Business Review published a study which included 30 years of data from 800 US firms where managers and executives were interviewed. And what they found from this study is that people could really easily be taught to answer questions correctly about bias, but they often forgot that information within 1 to 2 days. And in addition to that, they found that the bias training sometimes actually increased people's bias when they were going through processes like the hiring process as like a hiring manager. And so the reason that as they dug into this further, what they found was that these trainings are often done to be compliant and to preempt lawsuits versus actually identifying and preventing bias. And because they're not done in conjunction with other DE&I work, which includes processes and procedures that support this and continued training, they actually can have, they can backfire. And with that, what they did note was that nearly half of mid-sized companies do anti-bias training, and almost all of Fortune 500 companies do it. So even though there are problems with it, they're still happening. So the important part is not to stop doing these trainings, but actually to make sure that the rest of your work is supporting what the trainings talk about. Here we have those same 3 women sitting at a table, and they look annoyed and confused that anti-bias trainings don't work. So myth 4 is my business is too small to do diversity, equity, and inclusion work. Here I have a photo of, I guess, like a switchboard. I just thought this was pretty. It's very colorful wires. And my thought was, maybe you have a small business where the most of your support is not other people, but it's technology. So every company, no matter how small, should be doing this work. Even if you're a company of one, you can absolutely do DE&I work. DE&I should impact your employees, but also customers and everyone that the company does business with. So although I look at a lot of DE&I from the HR side of things, it is important to note that it's much more than that. So DE&I can impact things like marketing and your employer brand, your product, making sure that your product is accessible to all different kinds of people, as well as your supply chain. Who are you working with? Who's providing you things if you're creating a product, things like that. Here we have this woman. She's a small business owner. She's sitting reading, I'm sure, a business book with her dog on her lap. Myth 5, my company is welcoming, therefore we don't need DE&I. Here we have a picture of 4 employees who are of different racial backgrounds and genders, and they're standing around a table with their hands in the middle, sort of doing like a huddle, and they're all smiling. So being nice is not the answer to dismantling systems that marginalize entire groups of people. It's often thought that if you're nice and welcoming, that equals inclusion and belonging, but it's not the case. We want to make sure that people are able to be their authentic selves at work instead of, code switching or trying to fit in with the majority group. Here we have a picture of this very tall gentleman with a beard and top knot, and he's wearing a suit, and he's instructing an older gentleman with white hair how to use some VR equipment. And I just thought this picture was fun. I wanted to include it somewhere in the presentation. Our last myth that I'll talk about, myth 6, in my business, we don't see differences. We treat everyone the same, so we don't need to do this work. Here we have a red-haired woman who's wearing a yellow shirt, and she's sitting in a wheelchair typing at a computer. So I call this the colorblind approach, although it can apply to all different kinds of identities. It's often used when talking about race. People will say that they're colorblind or they don't see race, and so they just treat everyone the same. But it definitely applies to things like disabilities. I think disabilities might be the easiest example to understand why it doesn't work, which is, of course, we have this person in a wheelchair and we're not going to expect that they're going to use the stairs. So we can't treat everyone the same. Everyone is different, and we have to acknowledge that because people experience the world differently, they need different tools to succeed. And so that's what DE&I work helps do. So let's get into those definitions. As I mentioned, we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion. These all work together to be able to do this work successfully. We can't just look at one of these pieces. This to me really does encompass things like belonging and social justice. They're definitely all in here in this work. So first we have diversity, which is the ways in which we are different from each other. Then equity, which is providing the tools that people need to be successful. I like to mention how this is different than equality, which is equality, while important to treat people the same in certain places. Equity is actually providing people different things if they need them to be successful in a job. And that last example of someone in a wheelchair is a great example of, where someone would need a ramp, we wouldn't expect them to use the stairs. Inclusion is a sense of psychological safety, so safety on a team, as well as belonging at work while being your authentic self. And then when we put all 3 of those together, DE&I work dismantles systems of oppression by identifying barriers and biases, and then implementing change to policies, procedures, and practices. This quote from Vernee Myers from Netflix, she says, "Diversity is being invited to the party and inclusion is being asked to dance." So those are both, of course, important parts. And then I always like to add equity, because to me, equity is what we use to get us to the place of diversity and inclusion that we want to be. I wanted to just throw in a couple more definitions. I won't do more definitions than this, but I think these are important baseline to understand for doing this work. So we have privilege, which I talked about earlier, and the definition of a privilege is that it's a benefit or advantage that someone else may not have. You know, everybody in the whole world has privilege, and everybody has things where they're not privileged. So we need to remember that privilege is not a dirty word. When someone says that you have privilege, it does not mean that you haven't worked hard or haven't struggled. We all have, that's part of the human condition. But an example of this that we hear a lot is people talking about white privilege. And so what white privilege means is that if you are a white person, you haven't struggled because of your race. So any type of privilege that you might have, it means you haven't struggled because of that type of identity. And so thinking about that of the areas where you are privileged and then the areas where you aren't privileged is really important when you're diving into this work and dismantling systems of oppression. So that goes straight into racism and what that means. So I think of racism as being a system that treats members of a particular race as less than. And in our society, our system values whiteness and white supremacy and treats anyone that is not white as less than. And what I like to point out is I don't identify particular people as being racist or particular actions as being racist. How I like to describe it and how I think is an easier way to think of it and being able to dismantle the system is that we all participate in this racist system that we're living in. And we all do things that uphold the system. And so when we do things that are upholding the system of white supremacy, we're participating in the system and we're sometimes benefiting from it. And so we need to acknowledge, again, when we have privilege within the system and when we're doing things that are upholding the system of racism. The last thing I want to mention is coded language. This is language that is substituted to describe specific identity with seemingly neutral terms. This, I think, is especially important when we're talking about DE&I work and the ways that we don't address head-on the things we're actually talking about. So an example that I see of this a lot is when we're talking about hiring and we say things like the diverse candidate, or I want diverse candidates. And as I mentioned before, diversity is how we are all different. And so individuals, we're all diverse, but we wouldn't identify someone as diverse because it doesn't really mean anything. What we would identify is if a group is diverse. So when we're looking at specific types of identities, we want to look at groups overall and if they have diversity within them. But when we're talking about a diverse candidate, we need to be more specific. So if there's particular identities that we're looking for, or a candidate has particular identities, we should just say that. So if we're talking about a Black candidate, we should say a Black candidate, or a queer candidate, we should say the queer candidate. When we use this coded language, it stops us from doing the real work and actually identifying the things that we're trying to address. So I want to give a couple examples of where bias shows up in the workplace. And the first ones are going to address the hiring process, then I'll talk about a few other things. So this image here, we have a young Black man in a white lab getup, and he is looking into a microscope. This study that I want to talk about has to do with 127 science professors who were shown applicants for a lab manager role. What they were given was identical resumes, except for one piece that was different. So 50% of the people were given resumes with the name Jennifer, and the other 50% were given resumes with the name John. Otherwise, they were exactly the same. When they were asked to rate these candidates, professors viewed Jennifer as being less competent. They were less likely to want to mentor her. And on average, they recommend paying her $4,000 less per year than John, even though her qualifications were identical. The next example is kind of similar, but a little bit different. So here in this image, we have a young Asian woman with a polka dot shirt, and she's sitting in a chair with a resume on her lap. This is another study where 250 fictional people sent emails that were identical to professors. And these emails were asking the professors to, or telling them that they liked their work and they wanted to work with them. And so the people who signed the emails, there were a variety of names like Brad Anderson, Lamar Washington, and Mei Chen. And they particularly chose names that might identify the race as well as the gender of the person sending the email. And what they found was the women and non-white names were less likely to get responses from these professors about working with them. And in particular, the Indian and Chinese students received the most bias from these professors as far as not getting responses. So the next piece I want to talk about, because those examples show us where we see bias in the initial hiring. You might look at a resume and assume somebody is a certain gender or race based on their name. Or even once you meet them, in an interview, some type of bias that might come up there. But we also see bias play out in how people are promoted within companies. So McKinsey and Company, they did a study, or they do a study every year actually, and they put out a report called Women in the Workplace. And in this last report that they did, they talked about the broken rung. The broken rung is where women are not getting promoted into the first level of management, and it's stopping women from advancing in their careers as quickly as men. And this also, of course, influences the pay gap because women aren't getting the same opportunities that men are getting. So they found that for every 100 men promoted to manager, only 85 women were promoted. And they found that the disparities for Black women and Latinas were even greater. So they were being promoted at lower rates. They found that at the beginning of 2020, women held just 38% of manager positions, while men held 62%. And we also know that COVID was something that really impacted women and women of color at a greater rate than it did men, and I'll talk about that. So this is a lot of data. I'm going to go through it pretty quickly, but it's different marginalized groups. And of course, this doesn't cover everything, but it's just a few examples. So one is talking about people with disabilities. So a company called Abler, they found that 26% of Americans have a disability. So that's over a quarter of people have some sort of disability, whether that's physical or some sort of learning disability. It can manifest in a lot of different ways. And 43 million professionals of that 26% of people with disabilities, they are unemployed or underemployed. So this is a huge opportunity for employers of allowing people to work to their full potential. And a lot of what they see, this company Abler, when they look into why people with disabilities have trouble gaining employment, actually starts at the employment application where it's not accessible to people. So people with certain disabilities might go on the website. If they're visually impaired, they might not have an application that can be used with a screen reader, for example. And then they're already hitting that wall of, I can't apply for this job. So some things to think about there with people with disabilities. The next part is speaking to what I talked about with COVID really impacting women and women of color. So in December of this last year, 100% of net jobs lost belonged to women. So 140,000 jobs were lost to women in December. And this has been attributed to the resurgence of the virus at the time. But during that time, men actually gained 16,000 jobs. So while, a lot of jobs were being lost by both men and women, the net loss for women was 140,000. And when we looked at unemployment for Latina women and Black women, it was at 9.1% and 8.4% respectively, compared to 5.7% for white women and 5.8% for white men. So they were unemployed at higher rates. The next community, marginalized community I want to talk about is the queer community, or the LGBTQ+. So just last year, the Supreme Court recognized that sex includes sexual orientation, transgender status. This was a really huge deal. But before that, just in June of 2020, 52% of the queer community lived in a state that did not protect them at work. So it's pretty mind-blowing. I mean, there definitely were states out there that did protect the queer community, but a lot of them did not. And so we know that this discrimination is alive and well because it's very, very recent. The other thing, according to the diversity movement, is that 77% of transgender and non-binary people delay their transition because of non-affirming workplaces. So they're afraid to come out at work as transgender. And then the last stat I have on here for marginalized groups is that between 1998 and 2014, an average of 13% of older employees were forced to retire. So age is a big piece of discrimination that happens in the workplace. It's very common, and we don't talk about it as much as some of the other pieces, but it's definitely something we should think about when we're looking at DE&I. So some more positive statistics, because those are all kind of bummers, is we have the business case for diversity, equity, and inclusion. So in 2009, the American Sociological Association found that companies with the highest levels of racial and gender diversity brought nearly 15 times more sales revenue than those with the lowest. Also, according to abler, organizations that emphasize disability inclusion are linked to 28% higher revenue and 30% higher profit margins compared to those that don't. And in 2017, McKinsey surveyed 1,000 companies measuring profitability and long-term value creation. They found companies in the top quartile for racial and ethnic diversity on their executive teams were 35% more likely to have financial returns above companies in the bottom quartile. And for gender diversity, that number was 21%. So these are just a few statistics that show that doing this DE&I work and diversifying your employee base really has a positive effect on your company. So this quote from Thais Compoint, who wrote "Succeed as an inclusive leader," is, "If you're part of the dominant group, use your privilege to influence positive change for everybody." So this is important, of course, that everybody does this work, but in particular, those who are not in those most marginalized communities have power to really influence how this work looks in the company. But of course, should never do this work alone and should never do it without including the voices of those who are marginalized. So now I'm going to go into a couple different examples of how this work can look within your company. When I do this work, I like to do a holistic audit of all practices and procedures and policies. That way we can get an idea of where the work is going to be most important to start. Some of that can include things like surveying employees, interviewing employees, really getting employee feedback is a very important part of this work, as well as collecting data. So if you're not right now collecting different type of diversity data, you definitely should. Of course, always make it so that it's optional. If people don't want to answer, they don't have to self-identify. But explaining to them why it's important and why they should be bought into this work is a good place to start with that as well. But I'm going to talk about 3 different ways that I've done this work within companies. So one is looking at the recruiting process. Although there's so much more to DE&I than just recruiting, it is a really important process, and it's important for how employees are getting into your company. And so some of the things that we look at are the job descriptions, if those are written in an inclusive way, the language that's being used, the requirements that are on there, if they're necessary for somebody to be able to do the job. We look at sourcing, where you're finding candidates. Are you going outside of your network of employees to find candidates and look beyond what you already have? The selection process. So what are the things that you're doing within that process? Is there processes that are valid in actually determining if the person will be successful in the role? And then that hiring committee. Do you have a diverse group of people that are involved in the decision? This can both help make candidates feel more welcome, as well as eliminate bias, because people like to hire people that are like them. And so if you have a diverse group on your hiring panel, you can help to bring up points that might be different than, everybody thinking the same way about the candidates. I have a webinar called Dismantling Our Hiring Systems, where I talk with a panel of people about these points, as well as a bunch of other things that happen within the hiring process that can cause bias, as well as limit the number of candidates that you get within your pool. And so I will share that in the email if you want to check that out. Performance reviews is another really important part to look at when we're thinking about DE&I. So adding structure to performance reviews is a way to make them more fair and equitable for your employees. And Lattice is a company that did a study about this, about their own performance reviews. And what they found when they studied their performance reviews is that women were more likely to receive failure-focused feedback, whereas men got more constructive feedback. And what happened was, because the feedback was more negative for women, they were getting promoted at lower rates because they were looking at the performance review to determine who was getting promoted. And so what they did is they added more structure. They defined their job levels. They created clearer criteria for what people needed to meet to have good performance. And they added ratings as well as structured feedback forms. And by doing this, they then went back and studied their performance reviews again, and they found that that gender bias was eliminated from the reviews. So adding structure, as I mentioned, is really important. Identifying the purpose of why you do your reviews to understand, how you want to build them out. Of course, training your managers, and then communicating to employees. And I have a blog on my website, 6 steps to make your performance review a success. You go to workvisionconsulting.com/blog. You can find it there and read more about some of the things you can incorporate to add more structure to your performance review. Then compensation structure is a big one. So WorkVision Consulting does pay equity audits. This is something where you can really dive into your pay structure and determine if you're paying equitably and fairly, and also determine if you're paying people based on the things you say you're paying them on. So if you say performance is important, or years of experience, whatever it is that you determine is a factor in your pay, making sure that that's actually how you're determining pay. So with pay equity audits, we want to look at things like, what is your company's pay policy? How transparent do you want to be with your employees? How much are you communicating, and how to communicate those things? And then I have a free pay equity audit checklist that actually goes a little more in depth of all the things you want to include in a pay equity audit. And you can find that at workvisionconsulting.com/resources. So working with a consultant, I definitely recommend companies outsource this work. There's so much to dive into, and it's really good to have an outside perspective, especially if you're having someone talk to employees. If it's an outside person and they're doing interviews, they can sometimes feel more comfortable sharing some of that information versus like an internal HR or an internal DE&I person. And so for me and my company, the way that this works is really easy to work with us. We do a 30-minute discovery call to assess the company's needs, create a proposal of a statement of work, and then usually another 30-minute meeting to review before diving in. And when doing this, it's important to include all those stakeholders, all the people who are making decisions on doing the work in these meetings. And then of course, just diving right in. I mean, it's so important to get started on this. So I like to make it easy to get started with us. If you're interested in possibly working with WorkVision Consulting, you can send an email to info@workvisionconsulting.com and we can set up a free 30-minute discovery call. I also wanted to mention WorkVision Consulting has some upcoming events. And so next month, I'm going to be talking about disability inclusion in a webinar called Inclusion Through the ADA, or Americans with Disabilities Act. This is going to be on Wednesday, July 28th at 10 a.m. Pacific time. It'll be a 30-minute webinar, so it'll just go over the ADA as well as the Job Accommodations Network and a little bit about the digital accessibility piece as well. And then on July 22nd, which is a Thursday at 5 p.m. Pacific time, I'll be hosting an HR happy hour. Done a couple of these. It's for anyone in HR or HR adjacent. So you don't have to be an HR professional to come. You just have to have an interest, or maybe you're a broker or something like that. And we just all connect and talk about different HR issues, talk about diversity, equity, inclusion. Really anyone is welcome to come. And if you want an invite to that, you can email me at info@workvisionconsulting.com and I'll put you on the calendar invite for that. And then all the events that WorkVision Consulting does, as well as all the free resources, are on the website at workvisionconsulting.com/resources. So you can find them all there. And I just wanted to include some of the main resources I used. So Michelle Silverthorne is a wonderful DE&I practitioner. She has a book called Authentic Diversity. It's a really quick read, but has lots of stats, more than I even gave you today. And so I highly recommend checking that out. I also used information from a disability inclusion course by Abler. I'll include that link in the follow-up email so you could register for that course if you're interested in it. It really dives into all the different pieces of a disability inclusion. It's super awesome. That Women in the Workplace report by McKinsey & Company has a lot of great information. And then the Diversity Movement is an organization that does DE&I work and got some of the data from their LGBTQ allyship webinar. So thank you everyone for joining. If you have any other questions, please let us know. We'll hang around for a few minutes. Feel free to, I haven't been watching the chat, so I'll definitely check that out, but feel free to add anything else in the chat if you want to connect with people that are on this webinar, as well as just shoot over any other questions that you may have.
Yep, so I just, we don't have anything else in the Q&A, but I just sent out a chat for that. So in case anybody wants to pretty much add questions in either place, whatever works. So the happy hour, I've been to 2 of the happy hours. Really fun.